This is an editorial that was put out by the New York Times on October 9th, 1903. It's titled Flying Machines Which Do Not Fly, and in it they argued that, quote, if it requires, say, 1,000 years to fit for easy flight a bird, it might be assumed that the flying machine, or aircraft, which will really fly, might be evolved by the combined and continuous efforts of mathematicians and mechanicians in from 1 million to 10 million years. But the authors of the editorial were living in ignorance. Not an ignorance of the past, but of the future. Because just 69 days later, the Wright brothers achieved the first ever sustained flight of a heavier-than-air aircraft. Since then, humanity has flown above flying, so to speak. What seemed to Aristotle and Plato the impenetrable spheres of cosmology, what we now call outer space, were effectively penetrated. We put people on the moon, we sent machines into space, we now stare at the stars with telescopes situated not on Earth, but in that very same cosmos in which these stars live, grow, and die. The point I'm trying to make, without multiplying examples, is that physics has grown. It has grown a lot, in fact. Even someone as bright as Newton, were he alive today, would stare at the least of our inventions, half doubting whether it be an instance of sorcery or an outright supernatural miracle. This achievement, this absolutely magnificent growth, which is becoming less and less linear and more exponential, is undeniable. And physics, the living organism behind this, has not just breathed life into it, but also breathes through it, each new discovery or invention forming the organic matter for the next. But success can sometimes deceive us. It can blind us, just as the rich man who believes in nothing but money. The intellectuals of our day, dazzled as they are by the ever-brightening light of science, have started to become blind to other lights that illuminate. In all of this talk about physics, we run the great risk of reversing priorities. Knowledge is supposed to stretch and cover reality, to serve as the intricate cloth in which we wrap the universe into our minds. There is a real temptation, however, to do just the opposite. Being deceived by the embroidery on one of such clothes, we might end up trying to squeeze the cosmos into a rag that was never meant to fit it in the first place. The fact of the matter is, we have people in our day who tell us that only the physical sciences, and by this they include not just physics but biology and chemistry and all the sciences that can be called physical. We have people who tell us that only these sciences are valid. Now, that is problematic. Why? Well, the nature of the claim is problematic. If the person were to simply let us know that science is awesome, we would too sing with them that science is awesome. But the problem begins when they try to tell us that science is the only awesome thing in existence. That is totally not cool. There is a name for this theory, or belief, or whatever: scientism. It is the idea that physical science is the only valid way of knowing anything about objective reality. Or, in more diminished terms, there are perhaps other valid ways, but science is our best chance at it. It is the most reliable method. This confidence is almost always coupled with a disdain for all forms of philosophy and religion that claims to know objective reality. The believers in scientism are people who think there is no point in discussing even the possibility of a reality over and above the physical. A materialist philosopher would tell you that no soul exists, but the kind of person we are talking about would tell you that no soul exists and that it is pointless to think about it. A soul is something non-physical. We can never know whether it exists, since we can never measure it, nor bring it under a microscope. The same story goes for God, for immateriality, for causation, in short, for all forms of knowledge which give off the slightest odor which physics cannot smell. The sin of trying to measure the immeasurable. Everyone agrees that it is a sin to try to measure the immeasurable. But is it a sin to know the immeasurable? But before we answer that question, there is a question I want our opponent, if you will allow me to call him, our opponent to answer. He claims to believe science above every method to know the truth. some even believing that science is the only valid way. Very well then, let us take that claim, the claim that physical science is the only way to know the truth. How do we know this to be true? It certainly isn't a scientific claim. This does not seem like something you can test and verify, something you can observe in the real world, something tangible. So how do we know this to be true? The reply is all too predictable. The success of physical science in predicting natural phenomena and the intricate inventions it has given rise to, which is unparalleled, we might say, as far as any other method is concerned, is the reason why we must believe this to be true. Take philosophy, for example. Has philosophy put people on the moon? Has it succeeded in coming up with antibiotics? What natural phenomena does philosophy predict? Nothing. The answer is nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. From nothing comes nothing. Philosophy produces nothing of value, therefore it is nothing of value. However, things aren't quite that simple. Sure, the inventions are things we can observe, and maybe even the ability of science to predict too is an observable fact. But on what grounds can we conclude that predictive validity, so to speak, and utility are the only two criteria for a valid method? That isn't proven. If someone wishes to rest his case, he must prove this too. How do we go about proving this then? Several ways are possible. First, someone might reply that all we ever know directly is phenomena, hence all knowledge must necessarily concern observable phenomena. Or someone might say that he knows of no other ground for testing the validity of a method. Again, another person might inform us that it is because the entire point of knowledge is utility. The reasoning need not concern us. What matters most, however, is the joke. We are now doing philosophy. The hater of philosophy has fallen in love with it. Enemies have turned into lovers right in the middle of a fiery debate. You can only know phenomena? That is not a scientific theory but a philosophical one called phenomenalism. Only the physical is real. Again, not scientific but philosophical. And it's called physicalism. Or what about the idea that knowledge is for utility? Instrumentalism. But things are much, much worse, and it must be so since what such a person is doing is the very opposite of being open-minded. He is restricting the world so it can fit inside his head, instead of letting his mind expand to take in the world. After all, and this is the second point, what makes him think that science is accurate in the first place? This is an even more fundamental question, and it is even in principle impossible to answer without recourse to philosophy. Because even in principle, a scientific explanation begs the question. It is only if science is accurate that a scientific explanation could ever hold sway. The only way to look for an answer is to look outside of science, in our most universal principles, principles that do not have to be proven. In one word, the fundamental principles of philosophy. These are questions which science presupposes but can never adjudicate. Does the external world exist? How do we know our senses are not deceiving us? Can we know the truth? What is truth? All of these are questions that are presupposed by science and which must have answers if science is ever to discover anything. Think about this like a building, if you want an analogy. You can have the best bricks, the strongest pillars, and the most durable cement. However, if you build on mere sand, you build nothing strong. The pillars, bricks, and cement are the principles of science, its methods and conclusions. The foundations are the philosophical conclusions presupposed by science. If the foundations are weak, so is the building. No palace in the world is stronger than the ground on which it stands. But what if the principles of science are self-evident? Then there is no need to look for an answer outside. But what else must be true if science is to be reliable? What about the law of non-contradiction? Contradictory propositions cannot be true at the same time. This is something presupposed by science. But is its scope limited to science? Is it not true of absolutely everything we can think of? Why then apply it only to scientific issues? If this law is applicable to the behavior of photons, it is also applicable to the mind-body problem. And if it is equally applicable to the mind-body problem, then, provided valid arguments are given, the conclusions in the mind-body problem are also equally valid. The point I'm trying to make is quite simple and straightforward. If science is possible, so is philosophy. Sure, it is an entirely different question whether we can apply our principles to possible immaterial subjects, but asking that question is philosophy. If we were to reason and discover, like Kant, that we can know nothing but phenomena, that would be doing philosophy, not science. Whatever be the case, there are philosophical questions that can be answered by applying philosophical principles to philosophical facts. I could rest my case here, but I do not wish to, because physics is not just dependent on physical truths, it is much less important. Let me explain. We're all going to die, and since we're all going to die, is it not worth knowing whether there is a soul that survives death? We are told it makes no difference, but is that really true? Is it really true that having a soul would not make a difference? That there existing a God, if theism be true, is an insignificant fact? That the meaning of human life is a pointless question? Oh no, to think like this is the definition of losing the point. It makes all the difference in the world. These are truths of consequence, of infinite consequence actually. Billiard balls obey Newton's third law, and using it we may create rockets. The utility ends there. However, a man who believes in an immaterial soul would live in an entirely different way when compared to the man who believes in none. And if he is right, that changes our lives not just in the manner we live, but in what happens after our life for all eternity. This truth is, so to speak, the difference between dissolving in nothingness at the moment of our death or surviving after it. And if there is a God, is it simply not worth knowing whether he has revealed himself to us? Even if the answer is no, God has not revealed himself to us, the answer is a very important answer. It is not pointless, and it is not insignificant either. Which is why, although not all men can dedicate their lives to philosophy, every man must have in his life a certain philosophy. Not just any philosophy will be sufficient. It must be true, at least as far as the most important questions are concerned. Every man ought to love wisdom. In fact, every man who has ever thought already has a philosophy. The question we must ask is not, do you have a philosophy? You already have it, even if you deny it. The question is always, how deep and how true?